This is Greg Troutwine with Marine Technology TV, and we're very pleased to be joined today by David Parker, the head of hydrographic programs at the UK Hydrographic Office, to discuss UKHO's recent call for organizations to join the new UK Centre for Seabed Mapping. David, to start us off, can you give a by the numbers look at UKHO today using the metrics of your choice?
Yeah, hi Greg, thank you. I think it's fair to say that the UK Hydrographic Office is, by any metric you choose really, the largest hydrographic office in the world. We employ around 900 staff here in Taunton in the UK, and we also have a small contingent in our satellite offices in Singapore and Washington DC as well. Our Admiralty Maritime Data Solution product portfolio includes a series of around 18,000 electronic navigational charts, and they're made available to mariners worldwide through a distribution network of 182 distribution offices. And these products, because of that distribution network, these products carried by around 90% of the world's trading fleet internationally. And as well as meeting our UK obligations, we also are the primary charting authority for just over 60 other nations, where we support them in delivering their safety of life at sea obligations and producing all of their charting and supporting some of their survey activity wherever we can as well. And that leads on to my part of the ship, running our hydrographic programs team. And we deliver 6 separate hydrographic programs and programs of sort of data collection activity and capacity building support, all sorts of other things like that, on a worldwide basis, either alone or in partnership with other organizations.
So you obviously have a long and distinguished career in hydrography. Can you put in perspective the interest and the activity globally today to map the world's seabeds compared to when you started your career?
Okay, it's a very polite way of saying I'm old, by the way, thank you. It's fair to say that the interest in the sort of understanding of the benefits of mapping the world seabed has definitely increased. I think it's also fair to say, though, that perhaps the funding, particularly from governments to undertake that activity, has not increased with that level of interest necessarily. Governments tend to be perhaps inevitably very focused on the terrestrial terrain, domain rather. And hydrographers such as myself, scientists, engineers, etc., they've typically increased their demands for good data. That has definitely increased, as well as good data-led decisions to do with the oceans. Rather than speculation, people are trying to make proper informed decisions of how to best manage the environment, for example. However, it's fair to say that in many cases, that data, in terms of quality or resolution, just doesn't yet exist. So that, there's a shortfall there. And when I started my career in the early 90s, I think we'd mapped less than about 10% of the world's seabed. That figure has grown to around the 20% level, has recently been reported. So you can see during my career, there has been progress, but it's kind of slow progress. So if you extrapolate that out, we're a long way off. One big shift recently, there have been initiatives to sort of bring more attention to this problem, initiatives such as Seabed 2030, which the US have actually just signed up to a couple of weeks ago at the United Nations Oceans Conference through NOAA in the States. And that's really helped raise the profile of seabed mapping, but more to the point, the benefits to be derived from having better mapping of our oceans and seabeds. So I think, back to your question, there's a much better understanding of how our oceans influence life on our planet since the start of my career. That understanding has definitely built. And our view is that seabed mapping provides the foundation data set that all other ocean data and knowledge can then be built upon. But as I said, of the limited funding made available on a global basis for building our understanding of ocean science, only a tiny fraction of that, in turn, is dedicated to seabed mapping. So that's kind of one of the issues that we're trying to tackle at the moment, to build that understanding from governments and other sort of large organisations about how this information can support our understanding and knowledge on a sort of global basis.
In looking at your job, what do you consider to be the transcendent technology that has enabled those in your profession to do this job more effectively and efficiently?
Okay, well, I mean, the technology shift even in my career has been huge, but I'm gonna go for two, if I may, because they kind of interrelate very closely. So first of all, back in the 90s, when I started, we were predominantly using single beam echo sounders to map the seabed. So effectively, you drive along, you do a line every set distance apart, and you create a bathymetric profile of the seabed underneath the vessel wherever you went. What that left in between all of those profiles were gaps where we didn't know the depth. We had to use some of our skill as surveyors to sort of estimate where we could safely leave the gaps and where we had to infill and all those kind of things. We did have other imaging tools to use to help fill that gap, but the big shift more recently is the advent of systems such as multi-beam echo sounders, as also bathymetric LiDAR systems, and these have now become the predominant tools used. And what these are able to do, unlike that sort of single beam isolated profiles, is generate a full picture of the seabed, fully describing every single feature, along with also a good understanding of the measurement uncertainty of all of that modeling and measurement. So for the first time during my career sort of span, we've gone from that sort of partial picture to a full picture, and that's just enabled so much and reduced some of the doubt perhaps that was there before. I think the second pick, I think that pick's a fairly obvious one for me. This one is perhaps even more obvious and more wide ranging, and it's really the advent of global navigation satellite systems, because again, that's in my career path. It's easy to forget that GPS on your phone or GPS on your ship is a relatively recent thing. I know youngsters these days coming onto ships and doing those things that, well, they probably won't believe you. But when I started in the 90s, the United States GPS was just starting to become available for civil use, but it was limited in terms of its constellation. There weren't enough satellites up there, and the technology of the satellites as well, but also through a process called selective availability, it was intentionally degraded by the US government. So, what could have been 10-meter accuracy became 50, for example. So when I first started my career, we were still using land-based microwave ranging systems and other systems like that, which took a lot more effort to set up and a lot more time to manage and the maintenance and all that kind of stuff. So in other words, you'd spend a good, I don't know, quarter of your day sorting out where you are. These days you flick a switch and it just happens and nobody thinks about it anymore. But that wasn't the case even back in the 90s, certainly before that. So that technology is further developed. We're now looking at real-time sort of survey position accuracies at the 10-centimeter level, sub-foot level. And if you post-process that GPS information, and we've been doing this now for 15, 20 years, you can get that positioning down to the sort of millimetric level, a fraction of an inch through a static GPS observation. And of course, people are using that kind of technology to track things like tectonic plate movement and things like that. But we're using that in the survey industry. And of course, the outcome of this technology is perhaps much more significant for the users of our products. I'm just thinking of it from the surveyor perspective out there mapping the seabed. But the fact our users can now navigate at sort of meter level accuracy easily anywhere in the world, almost instantaneously, is really quite remarkable. And back to what I said earlier, it's only in the last 20 years or so that that's been a thing. And before, we had to devote quite a lot of our skills and quite a lot of our energy to just determining where we were on the planet. So in combination, those two things, the full picture and where am I think that's the big shift during my career.
David, as I referenced at the outset, the UK Centre for Seabed Mapping was recently launched with a call to UK-based organizations to participate. What is the timeline and the goal for the UK CSM, and can you quantify the response that you've received to date?
Yeah, okay. So in terms of the starting point, the UK Centre for Seabed Mapping actually came into being in June of this year, so very recently. So at the first meeting, we had 22 government organisations represented, and we hope to increase this number in the future. As I've said, there's more than 30 in the community in total. We're now working through a process of having these organisations formally sign up to be members of the UK Centre for Seabed Mapping on behalf of their organisations. And then that's sort of undertaken through a memorandum of understanding. And then the very next stage, we're going to be meeting again in October and getting down to work really at the working group level to start working on items such as national coordination, so coordination of all the activity within the UK exclusive economic zone, international coordination, because UK entities are doing mapping work across the planet, both in our UK overseas territories and more broadly, but also working on unified data collection standards and specifications. With our real aim is around sort of collect once, use many times, and no matter who collects it, that data is interoperable with all the other organizations involved. That's our long-term aim. And of course, that will increase the availability of data and increase the value for money that the taxpayer receives from that activity. Next steps, we hope to really be making a measurable difference to things like collection rates and overall efficiency of all the programs and things like that as early as next year. So we, that soon hope to be able to achieve a difference. And we've already had some achievements. So for example, in June at the United Nations Oceans Conference, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, through our leadership and the UK Centre for Seabed Mapping, the UK government submitted the UK Centre for Seabed Mapping as a voluntary commitment to the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science. So, I mean, in theory, anyone can put a voluntary commitment in, but the UK government did this as as an open and transparent commitment to help achieve the Ocean Decade aims, which are all about it's obtaining the data we need and the knowledge we need to sort of better manage and protect the oceans into the future. So although this is a very small part, it's still that voluntary commitment from the UK government is an achievement because it's brought the community of seabed mapping together and unified them in that kind of one purpose. And I think the only other thing to mention in terms of timing is about future phasing. So once we've firmly established the centre across UK government organisations, our next phase is to look to bring in academia and the private sector, because a lot of the activity that goes on, perhaps even the bulk of the activity that goes on, is outside of government. It's private companies, port authorities, oil and gas companies, whatever it might be, collecting this data. So our longer term ambition is to bring everyone we can in under that sort of collaborative umbrella.
Across our pages of maritime, offshore energy, subsea, ports and logistics, we talk regularly about the blue economy and the connection of waterborne activity to a country's overall economic output. In brief, put in perspective the role of seabed mapping in this blue economy conversation.
Okay, I've been lucky enough to work in seabed mapping across more than 50 countries worldwide, and it's probably fair to say that in general terms, none of the governments that these countries, within these countries, really truly understands the importance of the data provided by seabed mapping as part of their core national infrastructure. So, just like having an electricity network or a water network, data in itself, mapping, topographic mapping, hydrographic mapping in the maritime space is a key part of national infrastructure. And the moment the light goes on and that's understood, it's really important. I know a number of ports, for example, where improving information and knowledge of the seabed has allowed ship operators to increase the cargo imported or exported during each visit. And depending on what's being carried, what commodity is on board, being able to reliably increase your draft through taking on board extra cargo, even by 10 centimeters or 4 inches, that can be worth tens of thousands of dollars per visit. So multiply that out for every ship visit and multiple visits by that ship if it's doing a regular route. Just by being able to sort of reliably put your keel closer to the seabed because you've got a really strong understanding of what's down there can have a really significant impact. And I've seen that for real happening in various ports and countries across the world where they've had that increase. Other examples include implications on insurance. So some ship insurers don't want their insured fleets to be operating in very poorly surveyed areas. And I've got examples in my history of, for example, cruise ships who their insurers have started, let's just say, getting nervous about them operating in certain parts of the Caribbean. And imagine, in terms of blue economy impact, if a cruise ship operator decides to stop going to island X, imagine the economic impact of that. So again, seabed mapping is a sort of key enabler for that kind of work. There's lots of other examples to do with understanding your fisheries, habitat mapping, enabling you to protect your marine estate, which in turn is a national resource for you. So I think all in all, it's about understanding, in terms of the blue economy, it's about understanding that data asset to be part of your core national infrastructure. And just like on land, where we use topographic maps for just about every meaningful activity and nobody even thinks about it, we don't have the same level of mapping by any degree available to us for the maritime environment.